Yes, sir.
So you may have seen that Thank you. Yeah, you may have seen that a pair of liberal arts colleges recently closed, Tennessee Temple and Sweetbriar. Tennessee Temple is a small Christian liberal arts college, Sweetbriar, a more rural women's liberal arts college. So in many ways different than our own experience here. But do you have any suggestions or diagnoses for how Kings can avoid the same fate?
Look, the problems that one faces, the financial problems that one faces in higher education are formidable, and I certainly do not want to be in the shoes of your distinguished president. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that you have a mission. That mission is unique. The extent to which you can be an idiocratic institution representing principles that I think are essential for Western civilization will put you in a very, very important spot. And I think that spot will be recognized. So I think that what is very necessary is for you to continue to articulate what separates King's College from others. Again, if you're marching with the herd of those in higher education, it's very hard to make any distinguishing characteristics. But I think that there is something about this experience that is very, very unique, and that I think has to be emphasized. And in the end, that will be the payoff. If universities all look alike and do the same sort of things, and everyone is engaged in post-structuralism, which makes me sick, and we go through the same kind of experiences over and over, I can understand why many of these universities will fail. I also think that the MOOCs represent a threat. That is, the online opportunities represent the threat to many institutions. But when you consider what I think separates you, that is a devotion to true Judeo-Christian principles, I think in the end that will be the issue that will make King's College the great institution that I'm absolutely confident it will continue to be. Yes, sir.
Hello, sir. I was wondering because, I agree with what you said, but in kind of an era of globalization that we have, where that presents certain problems or certain adjustments possibly, where our exposure to other ideas and great books from other places sort of make those a part of our Western experience. Do you think it is legitimate to, adjust, I hate to use that word, our canon to include those that actually do have made themselves a part of our Western civilization?
Well, again, Western civilization is changing. There's no question it's dynamic, and I think that you have to be open to the possibility that there will be others. But I think that what you have to do first is to assert what you believe in, and that is the problem. The problem, as I see it, is that we're far too willing to accept a variety of different understandings, if I can call it that, and at the same time not willing to defend what is unique about Western civilization. Keep in mind that there was a great experiment that was created when the founding fathers of this nation built this nation. And there was a great experiment that occurred at the Magna Carta. And there was a great experiment that has occurred in Athens and in Rome and in Jerusalem. Those experiments are experiments that we should understand. They have created what we are as a people. They have made us very unique. The other day I was engaged in a conversation of precisely this variety at CPAC, and someone was saying to me, well, you don't fully understand that there are many civilizations that have created extraordinary opportunities for people. And I say, well, name one that defends individual rights. Because I believe in individual rights. Well, name one. Tell me where there's a constitutional provision for protecting individual rights somewhere else in the world. Well, it doesn't exist. And why? Because what is unique about our traditions have led directly to notions of the rule of law and to individual rights and to the free market that we enjoy as a people. So that, I think, is important. It's important for you to be in a position where you can defend those arguments. And that isn't to say you're not open to the dynamic character of Western civilization, but I think first should be the defense. Joe, always like to hear from Joe LeConte.
Herb, thank you for a very provocative talk and for that extravagant praise. Whatever you're drinking, I want to get a glass of it. But some people have described the moment that we're in as a kind of a lack of civilizational confidence. And I'm wondering if you think that higher education is it the most strategic institution that needs to be engaged in this, in recovering that civilizational confidence? Are there other institutions you would put on the list? Do they need to work in tandem? Just some thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, look, I think it's a great question, and part of the difficulty is that I have lost confidence in what is happening in many of the elite institutions in the United States. Part of the difficulty is they are no longer willing to defend their own civilization. In many instances, as I indicated before, you see three ideas at work. One is an ideological view, that a kind of hardcore anti-American attitude that has now become very prevalent in American institutions. The second is trivialization, which I regarded the silliness of so many of the courses that are offered. And the third is this increase in fragmentation or specialization, which I think also challenges the way in which we should conduct ourselves. There are overarching themes. I tried to identify them in some of my speech today. And when we talk about what an education should be, ultimately you're asking questions of who am I? Why do I leave my mark here? Recognizing the fact, as I indicated before, the derision of death we all face. What does it mean to be an American circa 2015? These are interesting questions, and questions that are very rarely addressed in higher education. So I have lost a lot of confidence in the traditional universities. And my feeling is that the Lionel trilling and bars and experience that I had is very rarely duplicated today, even at Columbia. So I think that there are other institutions that might play a role. There are think tanks that sometimes are more open than universities, which have a hardcore left-wing orthodoxy. And I think that if you are going to institutions of that kind, you can play a role. But I also think that places like King's College are important. I regard them as a beachhead. From the beachhead, you move further inland. And you think that this is a kind of incremental change that's occurring. But when you think about the role of King's College, for example, it strikes me that King's College becomes the beachhead, the oasis, for the way in which we would like universities to conduct themselves, or at least raise the kinds of questions that others in the university system should consider.
Dr. Linden?
Yes, please. I'm sorry, you have the microphone. Please, go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Linden, what is your view of Common Core for public schools?
I have a great belief in federalism. And what has happened with the Common Core is, number one, the Common Core is very often a way to attract government money into the states. I think that that's a terrible mistake. I think we have a 10th Amendment which clearly suggests that the state should control education and the educational curriculum. Moreover, I've had this conversation with Jeb Bush, who I admire on many levels, so I'm not using this as a way of casting aspersions on him. But Jeb said to me the other day, not so long ago, that one of the problems that he has, or that he has with my position, is that you do not understand we must move to world-class standards in order to promote an America that's competitive with other nations. And I looked at him, I scratched my head, and I said, but sir, the mathematics curriculum, to cite one example, the highest level of attainment is algebra, not geometry, not trigonometry, not calculus. So if you learn algebra, that's the highest level that's demanded of Common Core. How could you call that a world-class standard? For me, it's a marginal standard. So that was just one illustration. So I think that I don't think the Common Core, I think to some degree, has created an environment where we like to believe that marginal standards or lower standards are desirable. And the reason for that is that obviously there's a lot of back scratching in the creation of the Common Core. That is, if the standards are very high, a lot of people will fail. If a lot of people fail, there's a political outcome to that. Years ago, excuse me for this long-winded response, years ago the governor of Indiana, when I was spending a good deal of time in Indiana, asked me if I would design a test for 3rd, 5th, and 8th graders in the school system. And I did. And I worked with my colleagues in putting this test together, and the remarkable thing about it is that the first time the tests were given, I think it was 30%, 31% of the students passed these examinations. And the political outcry was remarkable. So the governor called me up and he said, well, wait a second, we've got to modify the test. The test is too hard. Now, Mary and Johnny are brilliant. You have to understand that, because if you're a parent, Mary and Johnny know everything. So how is it that Mary and Johnny are doing poorly on this test? It must be the test. So I modify the test. Modify the test, I try very hard to maintain some standards. Next time, I think it was 42% that passed. Still a political outcry. And then finally, the governor said, forget it, we're not giving the test. Now, this is the problem that you have. You're dealing with the issue of politics, and you're dealing with the issue of standards. They're not compatible. They're not at all compatible. And that's a problem. It's a problem that Jeb Bush is going to have to face during the course of this campaign season, and it's a problem associated with the Common Core.
Another question.
There's someone who's holding the microphone. Yes, please.
Yes,
Thank
thank you so much for your presentation. And I am familiar with the Columbia program. I've taught literature, humanities, and Western civilization at Columbia. So I appreciate also your viewpoints and especially bringing out the special qualities of the program here at King's. I just had a question in terms of there's several still surviving models that emphasize the classics and Western civilization, Columbia, and of course the Gallatin School and King's. And so what can be done in terms of maybe building more connections between them and propagating this model? So,
Well, I think, I talk about my Columbia experience, and it was one of the reasons why I created the program at NYU in the first place. I was inspired by what happened to me at Columbia. You know, they have the CC Hum continuum, that 2-year period where you studied civilizations, contemporary civilization, as well as the great books in the humanities. And I found it to be a very inspiring experience. So I come to NYU, and I finally convinced the president of the university that we need a program of this kind, because he would invariably stand up at graduation and say, the students seated before you can solve the issues of war and peace, income disparity, urban woe, and of course these platitudes are kind of silly. You don't even know they read a good book. And I said that to the president. So he looked at me and he said, well, why don't you create a program? And that's how it happened. I created a program organized around great books. But the story doesn't end there. And in fact, it has a kind of sad ending. I ran that program for 20 years. I tried to maintain standards appropriately. In fact, one of the things I did was I had students wear a cap and gown during their oral examination, where they had to demonstrate that they were conversant with 87 great books. And so it was a very serious ceremony. I had faculty members from other parts of the university that would attend. We would have several people seated in the room. No one was going to say on what's on page 52 of Dante's Inferno, but they would say, let's talk about Dante. And so the Divine Comedy obviously would be a subject. And this would go on. Let's talk about Plato's Republic. They wouldn't say what's on page 67, but they would say, let's talk about Plato's Republic. So I think that it worked fairly well in my judgment. When I left, my successor was a person who saw the world very differently. She and I were interviewed by the New York Times, and someone at the time said to me, well, tell me what you think the course should be. And I said, well, look, it's fairly obvious. I think students should be reading Shakespeare, and I think they should read Plato, and I think they should read the Bible, and I think they should read Aristotle. And you could probably guess the other comments that I made. He asked my counterpart, who is now the new dean of the school, what do you think it's important to students to read? And she looked at him and said the following, and I'm quoting, it's more important for students to read Toni Morrison than read Shakespeare. Now, I'm not opposed to Toni Morrison. Don't misunderstand. I think it's fine for students to read Toni Morrison. But Toni Morrison rather than Shakespeare? That's what I said before. To dismantle the hierarchical structure in the humanities is a mistake. Agatha Christie is not Shakespeare. Toni Morrison is not Shakespeare. And I think it's important for students to understand that. And unfortunately, my successor did not. So what happened is, after a couple of years, where Dante was taken out of the great books list, by the way, replaced by Frantz Fanon, and then Shulamith Firestone was put on the great books list. Well, I don't think of Shulamith Firestone belonging on the great books list, but the dean had her own agenda, and these were called great books. And I, at that point, wrote a letter to the president of the university and said, my portrait hangs here, a beautiful portrait, I might add, a lot more attractive than I am. A lot more attractive than I am, by far. And I said I would like it removed. Please remove the portrait. And it was a sad moment for me, because I felt that I had to cut the umbilical cord, that the college I created no longer stood for the principles that I believe in. And so that was a very, very sad moment. But I look across the academic horizon and I see conditions very much like this, almost everywhere. It's not only at the Gallatin School at NYU, it's true across the board, where in fact this orthodoxy that I made reference to before has now insinuated itself into every crevice of academic life. And so unless you adhere to a certain political position, it's very likely that you become an outlier. And some people are chastened by the experience. Some people comply. I was not one of those who could. I served in the university Senate by dint of my decanal position, and every vote in the Senate while I was there was 77-1. I always used to say to the president of the university, we must have a roll call vote, because otherwise it was just a voice vote. You'd never hear my discontent. So I think that, it's important to understand that there are standards that I think should be maintained. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important for students to understand what are the basic elements of our civilization, why are we here, what makes us unique, what are the true idiosyncratic features of Western life that put us in the kind of position that we're in today. And again, some of that is being lost. And it's being lost for a variety of reasons, including political people who believe that we should start looking like a social democratic European state. I think it's a mistake. Those states are failing. So why do you want to adopt a failing system? And yet there are many who believe that that should be the position. There are some who think that the United States can no longer play a significant role in international affairs. That's also a mistake. There's no such thing as a vacuum in nature. There's no such thing as a vacuum in international affairs. The question is, what kind of role should we play? I would be the first to say we can't be the policeman of the world, but let me also remind people that if you don't have a policeman in the world, it's a pretty dangerous place. So again, there are a lot of conditions that we have to take into consideration, some of it based on our traditions, our past, and I think it's important for people to understand that, and that's one of the reasons why you can play such a significant role here.
So you ended your talk by saying that the redemption of Western civilization starts here. And as a senior at King's, this is sort of what I've been hearing for the past 4 years, but I can't help but sometimes feel helpless. Besides rereading the Republic, what can students actually do to turn back the tide?
Well, first, I'm looking for interns. Let me know if we have any volunteers in this room. No, I think that it's a valid question. It's a very valid question. You stand as a journeyman, having read the Bible and having read Plato. You stand as a journeyman, and it's important for you in whatever organization you're associated with to play the role of the person who stands up and say, "This is the standard. This is why we are in Western civilization. This is what I believe in." Too often people become cowed by what I guess is the prevailing sentiments in an organization. And you have so many people who think they're independent-minded but aren't at all. You can be independent-minded because you have a traditional background that stands as part of your past, part of the experience that you engaged in here at King's. I don't know what organization you're going to be associated with in the future. I don't know if you're a future business student or you're someone who's going to play a role in politics, or perhaps even involved in some sort of religious activity. But it strikes me that wherever you are, these traditions are important. I'm reminded of one interesting story about a preacher who is in a southern church, and he's talking about end of days. And with great fire and brimstone, he says, "Let me tell you, at the end of days, there will be crying, there will be wailing, and there will be the gnashing of teeth." To make sure that they heard this message, he says, "Let me tell you, there will be crying, there will be wailing, there will be the gnashing of teeth." Someone seated in the front of that church that day said to the preacher, "Preacher, I have a little problem. I don't have any teeth." Preacher thinks for a moment, and he says, "At the end of days, teeth will be provided." Now, you have the teeth. You've been given the teeth. You can take a big bite out of life because of it. And I think that would be my message. There is no way of really providing a guide. There's no pathway. It's a question of maintaining the beliefs and the thinking that went into the experience that you had here.
Let's thank Herb London once again. That was fantastic, right? Thank you. Herb London is not going to vanish. I know a number of you still had questions. He's going to be here, and he's here. That's the good news. He is on campus. He's available to you. Get to know him. And I want to say one other thing that Herb would never say about himself. But once upon a time, when the King's College was recasting its vision for what it should be, you might wonder where the PP&E idea came from. This is the guy. Thank you very much for coming today. And you can talk to Herb, and then some of you will be having lunch afterwards. Thank you so much for your attendance today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.